Good evening, good afternoon. How are you doing today? Very glad to come to you to continue our study and to look very deeply at very needful subjects around the issue of race. Some people think just because of some of the hype and some of the drama about race has come out of our society a bit, that this may be an uninteresting subject, but I beg to differ with you. We need to truly understand what might damage or redefine the image of God. Please pay attention. Don't wait till the next crisis to get yourself engaged and excited about what's going on, but instead, make sure that you are prepared to look at these issues very seriously. Very seriously. We began a series of talking about all the things that had to do with race, and then we came to a place where I told you I would talk about race unity. And so we talked about cultivating a welcoming spirit, hospitality. We talked about developing cultural strategies. We talked about embracing a godly vision. Then we moved to racial solutions, confronting, advocating, having covenant relationships, and creating cultural competency. Then I said I want us to deal with how we can become a cultural center for reconciliation. We talked last week about white sacrifice. I wanted people to understand that white people have always been in a position to sacrifice and give justice to others. We can continue in this pattern through our society because it is something that is quite normative to America. There have always been people that have crossed over from the other line, even when it was not directly impacting them as individuals. And we talked about that, about white sacrifice. Today, we will be talking about the inclusion of others, the history of other people on the table. And that's where we'll be talking in particular. Let us pray, ask for God's blessings as we spend time together, and then let us look into some questions that we have from other people. Dear Heavenly Father, we give you glory and we give you praise. We ask for your spirit to be predominant. We ask, God, for you to rule. We ask for you to guide us and lead us into truth and not into miscommunication. Let us understand, appreciate, and value each other, God, I pray. I pray that we erase the issues of racism and that we draw ourselves to the issues, God, of the respect of humanity. Now, God, to you be the glory and the praise. In the name of your dear Son, Jesus Christ. Amen and amen. You know, we're going to look at in the incoming weeks, we're going to look at subjects that have to do with multicultural expression and ministries. How do they happen? And what do they really mean? I want to dispel some myths that are there. We're going to talk about bridge building, planned engagements, to have cross-fertilization engagements with each other. And then finally, I'd like for us to look at race examination. How do we examine ourselves? And how do we take a serious look at where we are in terms of race issues? And so we will also be taking a look at that too. Let me look at the questions that we have today and look to answer them. We have from the Merricks in Homewood. Question number 1. Several of examples were proclaiming Christians. How would you rate the response of the church leaders, in particular Christians in general today? I know there might be a decent amount of conversation about where the church has failed to lead the society on issues about race, on issues about humanity, on issues that have to do with justice and equality. And I side with you that the church too often has been following where society has already gone. And society, of course, doesn't choose a very biblical reason for doing it. And so the church may very well follow with a secular understanding of issues about justice or equality or race, and not do it the way that it should be done out of the biblical text. My prayers are that the church will never be annexed by a political party. They will never find people that are Republican and that they therefore feel their Christianity fits into the Republican Party. That people are Democrats and they feel like their Christianity fits into the Democratic Party. But instead, what we find is that people stand in opposition to their party and say that I am a Christian. I may vote Republican, I may have voted Democratic, but I hold my party accountable to what I believe to be truth, and I will not be annexed away from what I know is true. And so Christians must first be Christians, and then we may cast our vote, but we first are Christians in our position. And so I want to make sure that we do understand that separation that is necessary. It is great to have Christianity in our politics. It's bad to have politics in our Christianity. And so let's make sure that we can think through that process together. Now, there are some Christian leaders that I think have been incredible. I don't have enough time to cite them all, but I will cite four different leaders that I think that have done things which have been incredible in terms of responding to this. John Piper, you might want to look up an article that John Piper wrote and called in the accountability of one's character, that we simply don't just vote for somebody out of policy, but we also look for the character they portray. He also cited the fact that we have to be very careful that we don't allow for the fallen character of people to get into the church. Our leaders can begin to follow somebody who doesn't have character, and they could follow them and mimic their character and bring it into the Christian church, and thereby become modelers to other people in the Christian body. And of course, John Piper was citing the fact that we do have to watch both character and we are looking into policy. There's a gentleman, I can't remember his name right now, from the Christianity Today, and in his exit out of the Christianity Today, he wrote a letter, and the letter that he wrote was one that had to do with just this issue of Christians and character. The head of our denomination, Tim Hill, who sat on a committee, still does sit on a committee with President Trump, wrote a letter on behalf of himself, the denomination, and other leaders, citing the fact that he believed that his behavior, his words, and his divisiveness was not only unnecessary, but was unhealthy and needed to be corrected. And he stood out to make that correction on behalf of our denomination, even though he served on a committee with the president. I do appreciate the affirmation that he had made. Tony Evans began a series to look at the issues of race and to look into what was going on with race and how should we respond to it as Christians. How should we be on this issue? But that's four that I believe have responded appropriately. There's been many, many more. And so I'm not trying to be inclusive at all, just trying to draw the attention to the question that was asked. The second question is, what do you think are examples of people who have sacrificed today? I'd like to give one example in particular. There are probably many, many examples. We have saw so many people marching together, whites and blacks, and other people, other races of people marching together to protest what has happened in our society. I'm not talking about looting. I'm not talking about rioting. I'm talking about protesting. I've seen all kinds of people protest together with one another. And I think those have been sacrificed and those have been our heroes, and we need to celebrate them and what they have done. I'd like to mention John McCain, and I think that John McCain was standing in opposition of things that he did not feel were necessarily Christian. And so, though I think he sacrificed a lot, he did not want the end of his life and his legacy to end where he did not stand up for what he thought was justice. And of course, I see him as one of the heroes of our time in terms of not denying his policy, his party affiliation, but holding on to what he thought were right things or godly things to do. The third question has to do with what event do you think would stand out as an influential background to today's events? If when I was talking about last week about the Holocaust and Bloody Sunday, what would stand out today as an event that would lead us to a conclusion about that represents some of the crises that we're undergoing or some of the things that we are going through today? I think that the annexing of the church, the loss of its distinction, the loss of its ability to stand up and to criticize, to give clarity. I think that when the church in England became part of the society, I think seeing a film and seeing how the England and the church became so one that no longer could the church criticize or correct the government. And I think that we are falling away from our ability to bring criticism and to bring correctness from the biblical text to our government. Number 4, several of the examples were the examples about young people. How do I feel that young people are driving the issues today? I enjoy the zealousness and the passion of our young people, what they brought to the table. It's exciting to see so many young people involved and engaged in the process of making sure that things are being done in a way that really has a passion for justice connected to it. My one fear is that perhaps we could not necessarily pay all the attention to our history, pay all the attention to what the civil rights movement was, what has happened, and what has been going on over time. So I am somewhat afraid that our young people aren't connecting all the dots, and so they become a little more illiterate about what has brought us here, while they have the fervency and the passion for where we are. And so I would love to see the dots fully connected, but I'm very glad and very excited about the passion of young people to be involved in a movement for justice and for righteousness. The last question is, do you feel that white America is more racist today than during the past? My response to that is no, on 2 levels. On level number 1, I don't feel they're more racist. I think that we have progressed in the United States. But on level number 2, I think that some things that have happened in the last number of years have helped to bring to the table where people have had secret feelings or secret emotions. They've been able to come out and put those things on the table. And so I think we're seeing things that were there. They were just latent, and now they're being brought out onto the table. And I want to make sure that I'm not acting in a racist way. I'm not participating in ungodliness, and I'm not judging people by what race they are. And I'm making sure that this time does not bring something out of me that would be ungodly and would not let me honor other people correctly and rightly. But we have seen people's colors because of the fact that it's been easier to announce those things. All right, those are our questions for today. And so I want us to look right into the lesson that we have for today and what we want to talk about. We want to look at the history of others. In particular, as I said earlier, we want to be able to discuss the inclusion of others in the history formula of the United States. Now, of course, why does that become very important? Because we need to understand that we need to bring people to the table. Part of the solution, remember, this is all about solution. White sacrifice is about a solution, asking for the dominant race to come to the table with us and assist and help in the righteous movement toward the things which God has called us to do. And then number 2, on this particular issue about others' histories, let us understand how we can bring everybody to the table and honor the perspectives and the diversity that everybody brings. If we miss bringing people, listening to people, hearing people, engaging with people at the table, we miss a voice, and a very important voice. Let me talk to you about the history, because history gets erased sometimes, about the history of different people that do come to our table. And let's look at that particular history position that I'm talking about. Now, I got to give a disclaimer first. You know, this lesson would last forever if I had to bring everybody to the table. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to look at the Asian population, looking particularly at Japanese and Chinese, at the Latino population, looking particularly at Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, and then looking at the Native Americans and some of the history that's happened there. Now, again, this is going to be very cursive, but I hope that it gives you some handles so that we're able to discuss dialogue, come to solution, answers, and respect and understand a little bit of history. But, of course, what I really challenge you to do is to study and to know more about what has happened in our society and what has happened in this in the United States, so that you're best able to bring about solutions and bring about answers that are needful. Again, these are those four groups of people that I would like to take, three groups of people that I'd like to take a look at, and then particular nationalities within that, or two nationalities and one people group that I'd like to look at within that definition. Remember, when we say race, we're talking about people that are of African American descent, or people that we would consider as being black, people that were considered as being white, and then people would be considered as being Asian, and those would be could be classified as race groups. When we talk about nationality, we're really talking about people from different countries. So there's different groups within the same country, but that's their nationality. We talk about ethnicity, we talk about people's history, their ancestry history that ties them together. And so we'll touch on a piece of this, but I will be using nationalities to explain some of the geographical large areas that we'll be talking about on today. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is that of Asians. I want you to take a look for me about Asians in the media. It'll help us frame a little bit about what I want to be saying. And so Asians have been framed in the media in particular ways as being sneaky, as being crafty, as being evil, or always thinking of something that is deceitful to do. And one other thing about the media that is important, they not only were crafted that way, but also the media, when they portrayed Asians, they very rarely ever showed Asians. They actually showed people who are of European descent playing Asians. So Asians didn't have a lot in Hollywood and media, even though they were portrayed in media. They weren't portrayed in media for themselves. Other people portrayed them. Here you see three people portraying Asians that you might even be familiar with. These three particular shows that had been televised, was on television, or movies that were out there, and some movies that were The King and I, that was extremely famous, high rated, and won all kind of awards. But again, these are portrayed by people that weren't Asian, but we were used to seeing non-Asians portray Asians instead of Asians portraying themselves. Now let's talk this a little bit about the issues of Asians and what has happened in America on the issues of Asians, so that we understand a little bit as we bring them to the table and engage with them. What do we see here? What do we know here? Well, in 1875, there was what was called the Page Act. It was an exclusion of people coming from Asia, America, coming into the United States. There was the gold rush and also the building of the railroad. And while both of them were going on, Asians were feeling that labor call that was there. And while they were in coming over to the United States, some people feared their involvement coming to the United States. So one of the things they did was they excluded women, Asian women, from coming, thereby hoping to force the Asian men back home after a period of time. But they stopped the Asian women from coming over. They actually said this had more to do with prostitution, but it really had to do with the elimination of Asian women coming to the United States. They also passed laws against certain types of drugs that Asians would smoke and engage in. And so some of the first laws were passed that forbid drug use were passed so that they could stop Asian involvement and Asians being here in the United States. But 1875, particularly stopping women from coming over. 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was supposed to last only for 10 years. It was supposed to limit the number of Asians that could come over to the United States and be present here. However, it lasted until 1943 before it was finally appealed and eradicated. In 19 visas are the ability to come to the United States. It was forbidding of these of trying to stop people from coming here from this country, and particularly desire for them to want to stay and become naturalized to this country. In 1917, the Asiatic barred zone was created. It included both the Middle East and Asia in particular. And again, it was one of these particular laws that came about to stop the inclusion of people coming and make it illegal for them to, of course, be here in the United States during World War I. The next one I have to talk about is 1942. Now, many of you might be familiar about the 1942 internment camps. There were internment camps that were set up by the United States after we went to war, after the bombs, after the battle had started there in Hawaii and Pearl Harbor. We then went and said in 1942 that all Japanese citizens that were in the United States, they had 1 week is what they were given to pack up and to get ready, so that they would be placed in an internment camp. There were 10 internment camps throughout the United States that they were moved to and forced to live in. And so while this was occurring and going on, there were as many as 120,000 people. But you need to understand, 6,600 of them, 6,600, half of the people that were moved into internment camps were citizens of the United States. They were here and they were part of the United States, but they were placed in internment camps. This was caused by Executive Order 9066. 1,862 people actually ended up dying in these internment camps. By the 2017 estimate, there was probably somewhere between $2 billion to $5 billion in property and businesses that were lost by the Japanese because they were moved into these internment camps and they were never given their property back and their businesses back afterwards. They were taken over by other people. And so one of the harms that we did, because we were at war with the Japanese, we actually took it out on American citizens that were here. The last one I have about the Asian population is is one that I've added here. It's 1923. It actually happens before 1942, but one that I thought of importance. It has to do with a gentleman who was Eastern Indian. And he brings a suit against the United States so that he can be considered as a Caucasian and would be recognized as being white in America. He argues the fact that the Aryan race comes from the same exact area that his family came from in India, and therefore he would be considered to be Caucasian, be considered to be white because he came from the same area and from the same people. And so he argued that he was part of the Aryan race. Now, what's so interesting about this story is that this has been long argued what was white because of geographical, biological, and scientific evidence. Scientifically, you were from an area, from a people, it was part of your makeup, who you were, and therefore you would be considered as being white. This argument was brought all the way before the Supreme Court. And when it was brought before the Supreme Court made a very interesting decision. They decided, for the very first time ever heard, that race was no longer scientific. It was not because of where you came from, your geographical area, or your biological history, but instead, race was in the minds of the average common individual in the United States. Therefore, if the average white person did not think you were white, therefore you are not white. Since Eastern Indians were not considered and thought of as being white, even though they had an Aryan history that was shared, they would be denied whiteness, so he could not be naturalized into a citizen into the United States underneath the 1906 clause by being white, because they argue he was not white in the minds of a common person. So it became common sense ruled when science failed. And you can see how the Supreme Court moved the goalposts when they were challenged by what it really meant to be white. And so I bring that case in only to bring some attention to how the Supreme Court didn't base it off of what they said they were going to base it off of, science. They based it off of what they wanted to believe would be white. And so he was denied citizenship based on that particular procedure. Well, let us look at the next group that we have, and that will be looking particularly at the Latinos. If we take a look at that, that should say Latinos in the media. My apology, that hasn't been edited correctly, but at the top it should say Latinos in the media. And this way, Latinos have been characterized in the media, being very sexual, both the men and the women. That's why you hear things about the Latin lover, and also about the women being highly sexualized. See, when people are highly sexualized, you can abuse them, you can do sexual things to them, because you don't have to recognize them as individuals or recognize them as people. And so the media looked at it that way. The media also looked at Latinos as being lazy, not working, not being hardworking people. Of course, that has been dispelled 100 to 1,000 times in the United States, but the issue of being lazy. And then finally, being bandits, being mean, violent people. And so they were characterized as being very violent people. And so that's the way they were looked at and seen in the media. Well, let's take a look just for a minute at some of the Latinos, some of the history that we need to look at what's happened in the United States. In 1848, there was a big treaty that was made between Mexico as to settle the war between Mexico and the United States. That treaty allowed for us to come to the place to annex new land that became part of the United States. And the annexing of this new land, a number of people that were once Mexican citizens now became U.S. citizens in 1848. Because as many people will tell you from Mexico, we didn't move or come, we didn't immigrate into the United States. In 1848, the United States came across us and included us in the United States. So the United States moved over and took new land and property. In doing that, many people thought that the price was not legitimate and the deal wasn't legitimate. But nevertheless, in doing that, many people became American citizens in the process. In 1917, we had what is called the Jones Act. And particularly when you look at the Jones Act, it did a few things. It did a number of things. But the thing that I'd like to bring attention to is that it allowed Puerto Rican people who were in the island of Puerto Rico, it allowed them to become citizens of the United States. While making them citizens, it was very clear that it wasn't offering Puerto Rico statehood. Therefore, they would have representation in Congress. They would have a representative who wouldn't be a full representative. He'd have limited authority and limited ability in Congress, but he would be able to serve in Congress, and they would have no Senate representatives at all. So each state, no matter how large, how small, has 2 senators, and so they would have no representatives in the Senate. And they also were denied the privilege or the right to vote for the President of the United States of America. And so though they were brought in with limited ability to function. And so thereby limiting the representation, the involvement, and the engagement of people who are of Latin American descent, Caribbean American descent, that were there in Puerto Rico. But that's what happens with the Jones Act of 1917. They do become citizens, but limited participation in being able to represent themselves. In 1929 through 1939, there is classifying of Mexicans that live in some of our further southern states. And what they did was they denied their right that they had of citizenship, and they forced them out of the United States and removed them from their involvement in the United States. This was a total of about 1 million people that were of Mexican descent that had been in the United States. They were removed, and 60% of them, 600,000 of them, had American citizenship that were removed during that particular process. In 1948, one of those things that happened is we began to struggle until 1948. The schools have been separate for people who were of Latino descent in Texas. And in 1948, there was bringing down of that segregation so there could be gathered together in schools. So it was removal of segregation in 1948 for people of Latino descent in Texas school system. Also, what happens in New Mexico is that in the school system they legitimize a position where two languages can be spoke, so that people there could understand their own language while learning the American language at the same time. So they're very early in doing something like that. But before that, if you came into school, you just came into an American school, and you had to, if you didn't know American, you didn't know what was going on. And the same thing, school was segregated until 1948 in Texas. And so some of the struggles that were there, that were seen or had to be endured in the process. Let me look at the third group that I presented to you today. And the third group that I presented to you today was the Native American. Again, I did not change that slide that was up there. It says Asians in the media. It should say Native Americans. How have Native Americans been portrayed? And the reason why I use the media in particular is because the media is a primary source for imagery in our mind. So that if we see Asians in a certain way in the media, we believe that to be true. If we see Latinos in the media a certain way, we believe it to be true. If we saw Native Americans a certain way in the media, we again believe that to be true. My apologies for not editing the title that's there. So what do we look at in particular when we talk about the Native American? First of all, they were seen as childlike, so they were seen as not having a civilization. They were seen as not being people who had been living independent of European influence for a long time, but they were seen as being childlike, and they needed assistance and they needed help. And so in that particular process, they were never seen as being full adults, people that needed insight and needed more wisdom. Christianity in many cases was forced upon them. Throughout the history, there were sterilizations that happened to Native Americans to stop them from having children. And so a number of things happened, but they were treated as childlike. Number two, they were treated as untrustworthy. You've heard where people have talked about the inability to trust Native American, that you would be an Indian giver. That is, if they were the ones who could not keep commitments. Of course, being an Indian giver comes from the statement about how exchange would happen between the Europeans and between the Indians. But it went even further than that. It began to discuss issues about how we felt about them keeping commitments or ties. But the reality is that the U.S. government broke every covenant it made to the Native Americans. Every time it told them that this was their land, it took it from them. Every time it told them that this was their sacred ground, any kind of commitments they made, they came back and broke those commitments. And the Native Americans attempted on numerous occasions to keep their commitments that they had made, but they're portrayed in the media as being untrustworthy. Then, of course, violent, being savages, people that would do all kind of violent things to you when it's actually America that declared war against the Native Americans because they wanted to move them and to remove them and to take them to different places. Finally, the Native Americans began to fight back when the treaties continue to be broke, and of course they're seen as savages. But there's a deep question as to where those images may rightly come from or be placed. Well, let's take a look at the indigenous people, the Native Americans. First thing I want to tell you is that there were originally about 2,000 Native American tribes. So normally we only talk about 2 or 3 tribes. In some cases, those are super tribes. They're super groups, so that a number of groups collapsed and became part of a larger tribe. However, there were over 2,000 tribes in America, nations of people all over America. America wasn't one nation, but multiple nations of Indians. That's why today they're still considered to be nations of people, and they're still considered their land is being self-governed because the respect of their nation when people got here. The first thing is in 1830, there's what's called the Indian Removal Act. the Indian Removal Act that happens. In the Indian Removal Act, there are after they've been given land and given property, large number of Indians are being removed. There's a declaration made by the president to remove them to other places in the United States which were less desirable because people wanted to take the land away from them that was given to them. And so on this long movement that they had to go 2,200 miles, that they were moved on foot from one area to another. 3,000 Native Americans died on that journey from one place to another because people did not care. They wanted their property, they wanted their land, and they wanted to remove them to a new area that was there. And so we want to recognize some of the horrors, some of the things that happened, and some of the things that they endured here in the United States. In 1864, this was called the Sand Creek Incident. Over 100 Native Americans, both children and women, were shot and killed. They were unarmed. They were simply killed as an act of genocide right at the end of the Civil War. In 1887, the Dawes Act was a building of reservations to place Indians on, so the Indians would be placed in certain areas throughout the United States and be removed from other places. In 1890, there was called the Wounded Knee Massacre. In 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre that occurs in South Dakota is where a group of soldiers come and fire on Native Americans that are there and simply fire on them and kill them. And so it is known as the Wounded Knee. I want you all to look more into these things that happen so you understand what has happened to the Native Americans that were here. And in 1924, the Indian get the right to become citizens of the United States, called the Indian Citizens Act of 1924. And then in 1953, the United States reduces the land that has been given to Indians and reclaims some of that land that's out there. Let me tell you something very interesting about what we call Native Americans or indigenous people, and why sometimes we lean away today from calling them Indians. Christopher Columbus really believed he was on a trip. He was coming to eastern India and believed that he had made it to India when he got blocked by a piece of land that he was unaware of. That piece of land that he had run into was there on the Caribbean, and he had ran into land that the Native Americans were present and were there. He began calling them Indians that day, believing that he had made it to eastern India. Until today, we still call them Indians. But the reality is they're not Indians at all. But it is a term that has stuck, that has been used. And so many people might even see it as being inappropriate and not to be used. And so that we have to think about what are Native Americans, native to America, and indigenous people that, of course, were already here. Who do we bring to the table? What are the solutions? The solution is understanding the history that goes along with multiple people that have shared space in the United States. And so here we have Latinos, shared space, Native Americans, shared space here in the United States, and the Asians, shared space in the United States. And so we just want to know the history. We want to bring people to the table, and we want to be able to understand what there's been in their past, what they've gone through, so we can honor that as we begin to think about ways to reconcile, to unite, to honor, and to respect the humanity that we've been created in. Again, what are the solutions? The solutions are that we know that there are but one Adam and Eve, they had us, and we have small differences that are simply made by a genetic, small genetic differences. But the reality and the trueness of who we are is that we are created in the image of God, and that we need to honor that and respect that. That's a great way to bring about a solution and bring about healing in our land. Why don't you spend just a moment with me while we're talking about solutions, so that we can pray for that kind of level of healing for it to happen. Next week I'd like to talk to you about multiculturalism and which will connect to multi-ethnic, multi-race, and so we'll bring all those terms together and make sure they make sense so that we're able to bring about solutions in our time, in our society. Pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, I give you thanks, I give you praise, and I give you glory. Thank you for your hand that's upon our life, and I ask for continuous blessings upon us as we are reconciled, as you called us to the ministry of reconciliation. I want to bring about healing in this land, and I want to be used for your glory. I want to be a person of sacrifice. Use me, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you again. Appreciate your time. Again, if you want a studio, you can contact Talvin to get that. He wants to set up that studio for you. Here's his information, talvin89@gmail.com, and you'll be able to do just that. Again, appreciate you and appreciate this time with you.